Hi, it's Alex. I want to take a look today at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 56 to 58, with a focus on inference. Now, an inference, as you'll remember from your cheat sheet, is the relationship between a statement and the argument or the reason for the statement. We're looking for keywords like therefore, wherefore, consequently, accordingly, and it's important to differentiate that inference is the reverse. It's really the same relationship as ground, but it's in reverse. So in the ground relationship, you have a conclusion that comes first. That is, a conclusion that's supported by a premise which follows. In inference, we have the reverse of that. The conclusion comes second. That is, we have a premise that is then that leads us to a conclusion. So let me take a look at an example of that here in 1 Corinthians 15, 56 to 58. Let me read this, and then we'll take a look at arcing this together. Paul says, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore," and this is the main key word we're looking for in inference, "therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, be immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Now, let me show you how I broke this down into its individual propositions. First proposition, the sting of death is sin, keyword, and the power of sin is the law. So we probably have a short series here to start these three verses out. But thanks be to God, who, I think we have an explanatory note here on who this God is, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And then our focus today, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast. Be, borrows the verb here, be immovable. So we have two exhortations, be steadfast, be immovable. And then we have these participles, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So that's how I broke down these verses into the individual propositions. And after we've done that, we can start to take a look at the relationship between the propositions. And of course, when we have several verses like this, we want to finish the relationships within each sentence before relating the sentences together. So let's look at the first sentence here. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. So I said right off the bat, I see a simple series here with this keyword "and" right here. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. There's two things that Paul is laying down here right out of the gate. But, he says, but thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So we have what seems to be an alternative here to what came first. But before I define that, I want to define this relationship of the idea and explanation. It seems to be an explanatory note here, idea, explanation. This explanatory note about who it is that gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. It's God. And further expanding on the specific, there's a lot of things, right, that could be said about God at this point. Thanks be to God, who, God's done a lot of things, was the creator of heaven and earth, right? You could think of a list of things that could describe this God, but Paul has something specific in mind, the God who gives the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So he makes that explicit. And then we can come back to this word, this keyword, but, and set it in alternative to that first statement. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But, or you could say nevertheless, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that brings us then to this last sentence. And the key word that we see here, first of all, is therefore. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, be immovable. So I think we also have a short series here of two exhortations. They're going to come as a result or as an inference from what we had before. Be steadfast, be immovable, he says. And then we have two statements, both beginning with this participle. And notice it's an adverbial participle. That is how, seemingly describing how to be steadfast and how to be immovable. That is by always abounding in the work of the Lord. So this abounding seems to be pointing back to this double use of the word be steadfast, be immovable, by always abounding, by knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So the question or the challenge that this presents really at this point is this a series of two the adverbial participle points us to the relationship of action and manner. So is this a series of one action or a couple of actions followed by a series of two manners, or do these build on each other? And I think there's something building here. The way I read it, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, be immovable. How shall we be steadfast and immovable? Well, the way that he seems to have in mind as I read this is by always abounding in the work of the Lord, to be so committed to this that there is a sense of steadfast and immovable character here. So I'm going to try this on for size and say, have an action and manner here first. And then that leads to, if I make that the priority, this leads to a second adverbial participle right here, by knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And I think that worked for me, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to label that action manner, a further action manner, because I think this knowing is pointing us back to how we are abounding, or the manner in which we're abounding in the work of the Lord, which this abounding in the work of the Lord further points us back to this exhortation to be steadfast and movable. What's the manner of being steadfast and immovable that Paul has in mind? I think he has in mind always abounding in the work of the Lord. And then how is it that we always continue to abound or carry out this action? It's because of this knowledge. Knowing that in the Lord our labor is not in vain. So I think that's how I understand that reading, and I think that's reflected in how I've arced that out. And that brings me back there now to this relationship right here between 56, 57, and verse 58 that brings us back to our main focus in this video on this word therefore, pointing to the relationship of inference. And so I think what we have here is an inference in the second half of this verse. I'm going to go ahead and label that. So that I've arced this in response to what Paul, I think, is laying down here in 1 Corinthians 15, that we have, as we said, in the relationship of inference, we have a premise in these first two verses, followed by or leading to a conclusion. The premise is that although the sting of death is sin and the power of sin is the law, however, we can give thanks to God because he gives us the victory, this God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And because of that, therefore, we can be called to be steadfast and immovable by always abounding in the work of the Lord, by knowing that in the Lord our labor is not in vain. So this is the conclusion that follows the premise. This premise leads to this conclusion in this inference. So what Paul is arguing for here, I think, is that we have a God who gives us the victory. He gives it. We presently have and hold this victory. It's been handed to us. How? Well, through Jesus Christ, right? This God gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So it's pointing back to the victory that Jesus accomplished through his life, death, and resurrection, right? This is accomplished through Christ. So then the question comes, if that's how God gives us the victory, then when does God give us the victory? Well, the answer to that question is before any of us have accomplished anything in ministry, right? Before any of our ministry successes, our ministry defeats, ministry trials, ministry fruit, God had already accomplished this victory through Jesus Christ. That victory was already accomplished and has already been given to us, is already ours. So this victory, already given, presently in our possession, and then the conclusion, the inference that comes as a result of that, is that we be steadfast and immovable, not overpowered by the sting of death, the sting of sin in this life, right? But to be steadfast and immovable. How? By always abounding in the work of the Lord. And how is it that we always abound in the work of the Lord? It's through this knowledge, Paul is arguing. Knowing that in the Lord our labor is not in vain. There are many inevitable discouragements in this life, right? Sin and death in many forms, many manifestations. But we have been given the victory, and not just a victory, right? But the victory. We've been given the victory of Christ. And therefore, we can pursue the work the Lord has given us with steadfast and immovable perseverance, because we have this knowledge. Our labor in the Lord is not in vain. Why? Because he already gives us the victory. We already hold it because of the work of Christ. And that's how I would arc 1 Corinthians 15, 56 to 58 with a focus on this relationship of inference.